Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. My name is Katrina Lashley. I am the program coordinator for Urban Waterways at Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for spending a portion of your Saturday afternoon with us, and welcome to the Women of the First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit Community Forum. I want to quickly give you an overview of today's show. I will be posting the event program in the chat in a couple of seconds. I'm going to place today's event in the context of the museum's ongoing work. Then I'll introduce our panel. We'll have discussion for about an hour or so. Around 2:20, we'll open up for your question and answer session. And you have two options in terms of engaging us today. You can type your questions in the Q&A box in Zoom, or you can raise your hand and we will unmute you so you can ask your question aloud. The chat will be used to post various links and resources. The event is being produced by my colleagues Janelle and Mark today, so we'll be posting more information for you. Any comments and conversation that you'd like to have, please make sure that you join us and converse with us in the chat room as well. So once again, thank you for joining us. I'm going to dive right in so we have as much time as possible for conversation with our guests. So the Women's Environmental Leadership Initiative, moving forward, comes out of the museum's Urban Waterways project, which has entered its 11th year. And so really at its heart, this is an exploration and documentation of urban communities and their relationship with their waterways and by extension, their natural world. And so we operate from an understanding and framework that communities and waterways share not only space, but also ongoing histories. And so they're often reflections of each other. The health of one is a reflection of the health of the other. And if we're thinking about this idea, this notion that water is life, and I've heard that phrase again and again in conversations with our community partners, if water is life and water is everything, to have an accurate understanding of this relationship, it needs to be explored from multiple angles, perspectives, and also community experiences and disciplines. So our goal really is to document this relationship, to understand this relationship with a central question: if waterways in the natural world is somehow fades into the background of the life of cities, if waterways are invisible in the psychological and physical landscapes of cities, what does it mean for the people, the communities living along these waterways? And so WELL came out of our ongoing work, our research, our collaborations with our various community partners, documentation, planning for programming and different events. And I was very aware of the women who are working in these various environmental spaces from multiple disciplines, communities, different definitions of environment. And many of them were at different stages in their career. Some were just starting out. They were undergrad, grad, maybe in high school. Others were 15, 20 years mid-career, and others have been working in these environmental spaces for 45, 50 years and actually helped to shape some of these spaces. And regardless of wherever they are in their careers, we see these women as embodiments of an ongoing history of communities, not only defining environment, but also advocating for environment. And so the goal of WELL really is to play a small role in building capacity for the next steps of women's environmental leadership. ACM, we see ourselves as a tool, as a convener, as a platform, or one platform for these women in their work and their knowledge and expertise. And we're fortunate enough to be flies on the wall to document some of these important moments. And so one of our major goals is to bring these women into conversation with each other, either physically and virtually, around the themes of mentorship, education, training, and then leadership. And so launching in 2018 with our first summit and community forum, and continuing in 2019 with a second summit, and through the support of Smithsonian's American Women's History Initiative, we expanded our programming to include workshops, during discussions. We had a series of oral histories. And from those oral histories, we took 6 of the women's stories and we published Women, Environmentalism, and Justice, which is aimed at middle schoolers and early high schoolers to document the lives, both professional and personal, of some of the women that we've talked to over the years. In 2020, we were fortunate enough to gain the sponsorship of PepCo, who sponsored our WELL lecture series last fall, and who are continuing to sponsor this series of community forums. and the coming spring and summer lectures that we'll be bringing to you later on this year. And so during this month, Women's History Month, we're going to actually visit a portion of the history of women who have been leading these environmental efforts, take a look at present efforts, what communities are facing in the present, how they're approaching this work, and also how they're looking toward the future. And so for today's launch of Women's History Month, we're revisiting the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, which took place almost 30 years ago. We're not quite there yet. It took place from October 24th to October 27th in Washington, D.C. And we have participants representing civil rights, environmental health, community development, and faith organizations across the US, Canada, Central and South America, and the Marshall Islands. They came together in DC to challenge what were some, I would say, maybe convenient narratives that had taken hold in the mainstream environmental movement, that communities of color, lower income communities were not actively engaged in environmental issues, but also were not interested in environmental issues. And so over the course of these several days, through the participation in these various moments, communities reaffirmed their connection to the earth. They redefined environment, and the definition that Susana Almanza mentioned earlier in the conversation this week, that centered relationship of nature and humankind. It was a gathering that saw the framing of the 17 principles of the EJ movement. And also it was a moment for the communities gathered to tap the mainstream environmental movement on the shoulder, to call them out in terms of the lack of inclusion of communities of color, the lack of access to some of these mainstream environmental spaces. And so if you think about an exploration of the history of communities, and you think about those key moments, and we have the luxury of looking back at history, of sitting in a history class or looking at our textbooks or just doing research on our own, these key moments, we also often ask ourselves, what were participants thinking? What were their intentions to gather in those moments? Did they realize that they were making history, or were they simply engaged in the work? How were they changed by their moments? What lessons did they learn? And how did they take those moments and move forward in their lives, in their work? How did they kind of engage the world? How did they move through the world? And how did their work impact the present? What lessons can we learn as we look at the present, try to make sense of our present in terms of the work that they've done over the past 25, 30 years? And so today we have the chance to step into the headspace of some of the women who are gathered for that event, and kind of peek over the fence through their experiences and through this conversation to get a sense of what it felt like to be in those spaces. The intentions that were brought to the spaces, the context in which communities were living and working, and then the impacts that those several days had on the EJ movement moving forward. And so I'd like to take a couple of minutes to introduce our guests and then jump into conversation. Our first speaker is Susana Almanza, who is a founding member and director of PODER, People Organized in the Defense of Earth and their Resources, which is a grassroots environmental, economic, and social justice organization. Susana has overcome poverty, prejudice, and insegregated schools to face down some of the world's most powerful transnational corporations. She's a longtime community organizer and educator, a mother and grandmother, and she's participated in the civil rights movement as a Brown Beret, taking up issues of police brutality, housing, quality education, and equity in school systems and healthcare as a right and not a privilege. So we're very happy to have Susana join us today. Our next speaker is Dr. Mildred McLean, who is a 50-year veteran of the People's Movement for Justice and Self-Determination worldwide. Dr. McLean currently serves as the executive director for the Harambee House, Citizens and Environmental Justice, which she founded in 1990. She has worked in the fields of education, community development, public health, environmental justice, and people's liberation struggles, and has championed youth leadership development through the Black Youth Leadership Development Institute, which was developed or founded in 1988, where over 3,000 young people have been trained and put to work for their people. Dr. McLean has engaged with communities all over the world, assisting in building their capacity to speak for themselves, as well as participate substantively in decision-making processes that impact their daily lives. She's very focused in bringing attention to the plight of people of color who live near nuclear weapons production sites and to address the impact of radiation. She's a high school graduate of the Commonwealth School of Boston, a graduate of the University of Massachusetts. She holds master's in education from Harvard and Antioch, and her doctorate in education from Harvard Graduate School of Education. In 2017, she's a recipient of the Sierra Club's Robert Bullard Environmental Justice Award, and she also a recipient of the American Public Health Association's Damu Smith Environmental Health Achievement Award. She is a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother, and a godmother. Bernice Miller Travis is an executive vice president at Metropolitan Group, has over 30 years of experience in environmental and civil rights policy development, has developed expertise in cross-cultural and environmental conflict mediation and facilitation, multi-stakeholder design and planning, environmental justice, equitable development, brownfields redevelopment, urban river restoration, and community revitalization. She's very focused on environmental restoration and the inclusion of low-income people of color, communities of color, indigenous communities in environmental decision-making at the federal, state, local, and tribal levels. In addition to her work at the Metropolitan Group, Ms. Miller-Travis served as Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice and Equitable Development at Scale Solutions, Director of Environmental Justice Initiative at the Natural Resources Defense Council, Program Officer at the Ford Foundation, Executive Director at Groundwork USA, and was a co-founder of We Act for Environmental Justice. Additionally, she serves on the Board of Directors for Clean Water Action, the North Carolina Land Loss Prevention Project, Patuxent Riverkeeper, We Act for Environmental Justice, and also on this museum's board. And she's been a firm supporter of urban waterways over the past decade. In addition to all of her work, Ms. Miller-Travis was a contributing author of a landmark report, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, which we'll post a link to in the chat later on. And it was her experience really in contributing to this report, which in a way shaped her career moving forward into kind of helping to build a social movement at the intersections of race, environment, economic, social justice, and public health. Our final speaker today is Ms. Donnell Wilkins. She has dedicated her life and worked towards improving the quality of life for Detroiters and others through environmental and social justice. She is the founding director of the Green Door Initiative, a nonprofit organization promoting environmental justice in Michigan. She has played a key role in developing Michigan's environmental justice policy. She launched the city's first green jobs training program, has advocated for citizen involvement in public policies, citizen science, and contributed to many scholarly articles on environmental justice and public health. She is a recipient of many awards, most recently a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Detroit City Council's Green Task Force. She serves as a Detroit City Council's appointee to the Detroit Brownfield Redevelopment Authority. She has served on the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advocacy Council, or NEJAC, and served as Governor Granholm's appointee to the Michigan Development of Environmental Quality Advisory Council. So once again, we're very, very excited to have them join us today. So I want to jump in right away with our first question, which is a series or layers of questions. This is a question which you will hear me ask every one of our panelists for our community forums ongoing. And I think it's very important to have you meet our speakers as people, to get a sense of where they come from in terms of the why and the how behind their work. And so, Susanna, we're going to start with you. Could you tell me a bit about the community in which you were raised, your first memory or understanding or connection to the natural world, and your definition of environment and justice?
First, I want to thank y'all for having me today. I want to wish all the women out there happy Women's Month. Of course, it's Women's Day every day. We hold up half the sky, but I say we hold up 2/3 of the sky. I grew up in poverty, in East Austin, which was a historically area where it was segregated between East and West. The Highway 35 was the racial divide in Austin, Texas. And even though we lived in the urban core, it was more like we lived in the rural area. And so where I lived, I grew up on East 10th Street. And if you cross the street, that was the beginning of the African-American communities. Of course, some African-Americans said it started on MLK Drive and ended on 10th Street. And so where I lived, a Latino community began heading south. Of course, other people say the Latino community ended on 10th Street. And so I grew up in a very Black and brown community and having friends that were African American. And I grew up in the era where it was the height of segregation and racial prejudice. My parents didn't speak English. They really had no formal education, but they had a lot of knowledge and wisdom. And I was real fortunate to have them as my parents. I come from a family of 10, and basically everyone in my neighborhood had large families. And so when two families got together, the kids got together, you thought a baseball tournament was happening, but it was just two families getting together That's the way things were. Of course, in the segregated part of East Austin, the streets were not paved, there wasn't lighting. All of the things that, people take for granted now, gutters, lighting, sidewalks, all this stuff did not really exist in the segregated part of East Austin. But I feel real fortunate. My realization in the environment and recognizing is because, like I said, even though we were in the urban core, we had chickens. We had chickens and we had rabbits, and my mother gardened. We grew lettuce, tomatoes, beans. And my mother also was a healer. So we always had a big spider net on the side of the house that my mom would not let us touch. We could feed it ants and watch it because that was the natural band-aids for cuts and so forth in our community. And so that really grounded me. We were rooted, very much rooted in the earth. And that's how I see the environment through a real indigenous perspective, that the earth was not just a planet, it was a mother. It was Mother Earth to us. And that the Mother Earth, our air was her lungs, our blood was her water, and her skin was the soil, and of course, the complement of the father was the sun. And so when you looked at all of those four elements, it was also what sustained life. But it was Mother Earth that was giving us that life, that natural resources. And so I looked at it as defining the environment as that natural setting, but as humanity is part of it. And that's why I said that mainstream groups would look at the environment as only as nature kind, the whales, the spotted owls, etc. But we looked at it as people. People were part of Mother Earth. It's just like our parents gave us birth, Mother Earth gave humanity birth. And so we looked at it as human, as nature kind and humankind, interwoven, interlocked, and inseparable. You really couldn't separate it. So at a very early age, I understood that concept of the earth. But it was also going to, because I had a lot of brothers, and so we got to explore all the creeks in Austin, Shoal Creek, all the Barton Creek, um, Go Valley, just all the little creeks that existed in it. And so really understanding the water, and back then it wasn't polluted like it is today. And there's some creeks don't have water. Back then they did have water. And also knowing like the trees. We all did our own community assessment. Where were the mulberry trees? Where were the plum trees? Where were the peach trees? Where were the pecan trees? All of these things at a very, very early age, knowing, that the waterways, that the trees, that all gave us life and tasteful life too. When you bit into that plum or to that sweet peach tree, and all of these things, and everything very organic at that time. Everything really grown fresh and or either bought freshly. Uh, was my kind of understanding and my connection at a very early age to Mother Earth and to a lot of beliefs in the healing process, knowing that our parents and our people were the healers at that time, and more of the indigenous and not the Western part of healing, but that particular understanding.
And how would you define justice?
Well, justice is equity to me, is that you have to have equity to have justice. You have to have fairness to have justice. And so in looking at um, all the different things and growing up and all the different segregation and living that time, right away that that's not equity, and it's not justice, because if you cross the highway, you could see the homes, you could see the sidewalks, you could see everything. And also the treatment, because you spoke a second language. If you spoke Spanish, it was like, oh, how terrible. You at that time, it was not, we would get our mouths taped or washed out with soap or paddling if we spoke Spanish. So very early understanding that we lived in a society with a lot of injustice, and that a society did not look equitable at all. And so my whole definition is the whole justice of being fairness, of there being equity, and that recognizing our relationship with Mother Earth.
Dr. McLean, could you tell us about the community in which you were raised, your experiences in the natural world, and your definitions of environment and justice?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I was born in a little small rural town in Georgia called Georgetown, Georgia. And I was born on a plantation and actually born in a peanut field, feet first. So that was my first intersection with Mother Earth, feet first in a peanut field. Uh, and we lived on that plantation until I was about 3 years old. And then my mom moved to Savannah, Georgia. And that's actually where I was raised, in Savannah, Georgia, which is a small city, coastal city, right on the ocean. And at that time, it was what we call a country city, because it wasn't like Atlanta. We were, we was a stepchild of Georgia, but it was a segregated city. I lived and was raised in segregated communities, segregated schools, segregated facilities, segregated churches, segregated. But it was wonderful because there we respected each other, we respected the land, because most of us came from families who were farmers, who had an agricultural base. And even though we lived in Savannah, at least 3 or 4 times a year, we would go back to Georgetown to my aunt's farm and get vegetables to bring back home. I am the proud granddaughter of Maddie McLean and William McLean. I am the firstborn daughter of Lorene McLean Singleton, and she was the baby of 14 children that Maddie and William had. That is our legacy, and all of those except 2 lived to be adults and had lots of children. We believe in lots of children. And growing up in Savannah, my connection with the land was through the parks. Savannah is known for a gazillion parks. And also me going barefoot. My mom said that I didn't like shoes, and I ain't gonna tell you the other thing I didn't like. And so I would be always in the streets playing barefoot, and grew to really love the soil. My mama said that I used to eat up the Georgia red clay. It was so sweet. But I think more than being sweet, it was very healing. And like Susanna said, our parents, our grandparents, our aunts, they all engaged in what we call now alternative or traditional medicine. But they were very good at it. They could identify herbs that could deal with a cold or a cut or stepping on the nail. You step on a nail, you get a piece of fat back and a penny and tied up, and draw all the pus out. So you didn't have to worry about these expensive drugs that come through our pharmacies that really create more problems than they solve. I was also tied to the water. My DNA is we looked back to the DNA, and it says that my mother's people came from Guinea. We are from the Fulani people, and that we were first generation slaves coming over on the Middle Passage. And we did come through Savannah. And so my connection with the ocean is very, very intimate. I also practice Orisha traditional religion, and I am a priestess of Yemonja, who governs the ocean. And I also have Olukami, which is the bottom of the ocean. And so my ancestral connection to the ocean is very deep. But here in Savannah, during my growing up, we could not go to the ocean in Savannah. We had to travel all the way to a place called Hilton Head, South Carolina. And it was there that Black men, let me repeat that, Black men owned 3 beaches in South Carolina. So my mother, one of her requirements after my father, her boyfriend had to have a car because on every Sunday he had to take us to the ocean in South Carolina. And we learned a reverence for the ocean. We knew that we would run in that ocean, and when we came out, snot, if you will, excuse me, would be coming out of your nose, and you would turn gray and everything. But we were told that we were being detoxed from a lot of the foods that were of not good quality unless it was the vegetables from my auntie's farm. So that's the city that I was raised in. It was segregated, but I went to schools where the teachers really loved you. They understood you. My first grade teacher told me that Mildred said, look at him. You're black, you ugly, you got big lips, you got a big nose, and you got nappy head. So the only way you're gonna make it in this world is through education. I took that thing real serious. And so I was bent on going to school and doing well. My mom was an earth person. We called it Big Low. And we learned our appreciation of Mother Earth, because we don't call her Mother Earth, we call her Big Mom. You know, you call the matriarch in Black communities and others Big Mama. Well, we called Earth Big Mama because she gave us so much. Even at that time, even though we may not have had a garden, we were growing in buckets. So you got your food out the buckets, but that came from Big Mama because it was the soil and the water combined that produced that food. My definition of the environment is the one that we use. It's everything, it's everywhere. It's where we live, where we work, where we play, where we make love, where we eat, where we worship. It's everywhere. So you can't get around it. It's your air, it's your water, it's your family, it's the hood, it's the community, it's the globe, it's the planet. I don't really have a definition for justice because I ain't seen it yet. I don't know what it looked like. You know, you can say it's fairness, it's equity, it's whatever. So for me right now, I'm like on the self-determination, Kujichagulia, the second principle of the Nguzo Saba, where justice means that I'm able to decide for myself. I'm able to speak for myself. I'm able to advocate for myself, champion myself, analyze for myself. Now, if I ask you for some help, that's cool in the game. But I haven't really seen justice. When you look at justice in the global context, often people don't talk about justice. They talk about liberation. That's where I'm at. I don't want no justice because I think you can take justice away very easily, because in the environmental justice movement for the last 30 years, we have fought for just policies. And in 4 years, someone was able to come and almost strike down everything that we thought was a just policy, a just statute, a just ordinance to ensure justice. But somehow it was snatched from us. So I'm still working on the definition. And when I get one, I'll let everybody know. But I think for us here in Savannah, to be just is to exercise self-determination. But I don't even fool around with that equity stuff, even though I work with the Partnership for Southern Equity and I advocate equity, I define equity. I'm doing equity workshops. I'm on the Real Equity Task Force in Savannah to find out about equity. But I just do that because that's what is on the table now. But I always tell everybody, equity is a train stop, if you will, on the way to liberation. And we want our people to be liberated. So whatever kind of hood they want, whatever kind of whatever, they make that decision. And they are not victims of the extractive economy and the white supremacists who have no respect and no regards for us. Because remember, there are still laws on the books in these United States that say people of color are not human, that we are still 3/5 of or something. I don't know what that looked like, but so that's my story and I'm sticking to it.
Bernice, Could you tell us a little bit about the community in which you were raised, your first connections, understanding of the natural world, and your definitions of environment and justice?
Would love to. So I'm from New York, and when you say that, I'm from New York City. And when you say that, people immediately think of the big buildings and Wall Street and Broadway and Lincoln Center and all the things that are projected about New York. But I'm from the village of Harlem, which is in northern Manhattan. And Harlem, when I was growing up in Harlem, which was in the 1960s, it was the largest concentration of people of African descent outside of the continent of Africa. There were more Black people living in Harlem than any place else in the United States of America. And Harlem is physically a small place, but it was a whole bunch of people in a really small place. And most of those people were from two places. They were either from the Deep South or they were from the Caribbean. And there was no separation between what we experienced in New York and the grounding and the cultures that our families grew up in. It came with them and it surrounded us. So much so that farmers used to drive to New York City from all over the South, and they would put food from the South, from farms and fields in the South, put them in big trucks, 18-wheelers, and bring them right to Harlem, to the main drags. And people would line up for miles to get collard greens that they were familiar with eating, to get mustard greens that they were familiar with eating. For us, my family, who were from Maryland, my mother's family, who were from Maryland, we could not wait until the fishmongers came. And my grandmother in particular, because shad was her favorite fish, and you can only get shad from Maryland or from North Carolina or South Carolina. And then the Caribbean part of the community, I don't know how many Black people we left in the Caribbean, but it was a whole heap of them in Harlem when I grew up in Harlem. And my dad, who was from the Bahamas, who was a first generation, he immigrated to the Bahamas, immigrated from the Bahamas to Miami, Florida. And then from Miami, Florida, he came to New York in 1929. Yes, the year of the Great Depression. My father moved from Miami to New York. And he moved here because he had gone, his mother was Haitian, and he had gone to Catholic school all his life. And when it was time for him to be able to go to college, I should say he was born in 1909. So college for him was way back deep in segregation. And when it was time for him to go to college, he had thought he was going to be the first Black priest in Florida. Don't ask me why he thought that, but he thought that. And so he's going to apply to the one college that there was at the time in Florida, St. Augustine College in St. Augustine, Florida, which was a Catholic school. And he wrote to them and supplied his, application and all of that. And they promptly wrote him back and let him know that they did not accept colored applicants. And my dad never got over that, even though, that was in the 1920s. And he lived until he died the year after the summit. He never got over that experience. And so he grounded me, as is the experience of many immigrants, but particularly immigrants from the Caribbean. We are so serious about education and so serious about what was denied people in home countries and home islands, and what they drilled in their children and their grandchildren that were expected of them. And so for me, even though we were working class, we were not, as my mother would say, we were not dirt poor, but we couldn't miss no paychecks, right? So, and what they instilled in me is that I had to get a really good education, because that was the only way that I was going to be able to have any kind of life that was beyond the menial things that most Black people were assigned to do. And my daddy told me that that was not the path that he had cut out for me. So I also grew up during the Black Power movement. I grew up during the Black Arts movement. I grew up during the women's rights movement. I grew up during the anti-war movement. All of this was happening on the streets of Harlem, all of it, every day, all day. I remember both of my parents worked at Harlem Hospital where they met. I was born in Harlem Hospital. My mother was a nurse there. My dad was in the part of the hospital where you go to get an appointment to go see a doctor. And the old hospital, which was a hospital I was born in, was right on the corner of 135th Street and Lenox Avenue, which is like a major intersection in Harlem, major thoroughfare. And this is not an exaggeration. Many a day, my babysitter would bring me from school to the hospital, 2 blocks. This is when I was a little kid in elementary school. And I would wait for my mom or my dad. And most times I would come home with my mother, and we would come out the hospital on 135th Street and Lenox Avenue. And there would be this man out there speaking on a milk cart. And he would be out there all the time. And there was just something about him that just so spoke to me. And I was a little kid, a really little kid. And I remember many a time my mother almost wrenching my arm out of the socket, pulling me away from standing on the edge of the crowd to listen to him. Him was Malcolm X. And 135th Street and Lenox Avenue, right there at Harlem Hospital, is where the largest aggregation of Black people would be, both at the subway station and at the hospital. And so he picked the spot where you could talk to the most Black people, which was right in front of the hospital. And I just was fascinated by him, but we were Catholic. So my mother didn't want to hear nothing about the Nation of Islam. But the Nation of Islam was growing in power and influence. Mosque number 7, which was Malcolm's mosque, was walking distance from the hospital, walking distance from my elementary school. It was an incredible thing to grow up in Harlem at that moment. And everything that I have ever done in my life, everything is because I grew up in that community, loved by people in that community, loved for my entire life by people in that community who grew up with my mother, who were members of the Masonic Temple with my dad, who had been in the union with my father, AFSCME Local District Council 37, one of the largest unions in the United States, majority people of color, a huge stalwart of the civil rights movement, District Council 37. So all of this was going on in my house every day. And on television every night. My daddy watched the news every night. We ate dinner and watched the news at the same time. And this is what we saw every night. Black people being pummeled and brutalized and treated like garbage was on the news every single night because it was playing out live, you know? So when you grow up in a construct like that, and that's what's all around you, you almost have no option but to do something in service of your people, because it's your people that made it possible for you to do all of the things that you did. So when I went to college at Columbia University, an institution in the heart of Harlem, an Ivy League school, it was a horrible place to be, even though it was in the middle of Harlem, because they definitely did not care for Black and brown people. And they let you know that every single day. And so I would try to say to my dad, you know, this is not the most welcoming place. And my father would look at me like, you've got to be kidding me. You have a full scholarship to go to one of the foremost institutions in the United States of America. I don't care if they burn a cross in front of your door. You're going to throw water on that cross and you're going to walk around it and you're going to go to class every day, right? I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to hear about you know, students in the Black Students Union making up. He said we were making up stuff, right? Going out there and picketing, and you want this and you want that. He said, really? Really? You just need to go to school. That's what you need to do. So that's a West Indian thing. I can't speak for the people, the Africans from the continent who have come to Harlem. I can't speak for anybody else's experience. I'm just telling you, as somebody who grew up in a West Indian household, there was no option but to go to college. There was no option but to finish school. And there was no option but to come back and do something in service of your people. So, and I did and I do go and visit my family in the Bahamas. My dad and I went every summer. Most Black people in Harlem went down south, back to wherever the family was. My dad and I got on a plane and went to the Bahamas and spent the whole summer, every summer, with my family 14 kids, a mother and a father. My Uncle Roy, my dad's brother, first licensed Black contractor in the Bahamas, and helped to build the labor movement, construction trades in the Bahamas. And for me, an only child, it was like paradise. One, I lived right next to the East River or the Harlem River, which was so Black and so filthy and so dirty. When I was growing up, it was hard to even conceive of it as a river. And then across town was the Hudson River, the mighty, mighty, mighty Hudson River. Also a filthy, dirty, polluted, horrific entity when I was growing up there. So the lower Hudson River, which is the part of Hudson River that abuts Harlem and lower Manhattan, was a dead ecological zone in the 1960s when I was growing up. There was no plant life, no plankton, no fish, no anything alive. So going to the Bahamas let me know this is what the world is supposed to look like. Even today, when you are in a plane and you're about to land in the Bahamas and you could still be 10,000, 15, 20,000 feet in the air, you look out the window and you look straight down to the bottom of the ocean. That's how clean the water is. The food, the fish, the fruit, the everything, right? And so by doing that every summer, my dad and I, it gave me a rooting of who I was, what tribe I was from, what the world was supposed to look like. And then we would come back to Harlem and you just couldn't escape it. Something is really wrong here. You know, the people in the Bahamas may not have the same income levels that we have, but they have a quality of life that's far superior than anything that we would ever achieve in New York City. And I'm so thankful to my dad for exposing me to that every summer, because between growing up in Harlem and spending my summers in the Bahamas with my family, that's why I do what I do.
Thank you. Ms. Wilkins, tell us a little bit about the community in which you were raised, your connections to the natural world, and definitions of environment and justice.
Thank you. First of all, I have to follow this. I have to follow these amazing sisters. Thank you for having me today. Born and raised in the city of Detroit, where we put the world on wheels. The automobile industry was the place where everybody worked or lived near or what have you. And I would say that while I grew up in the city of Detroit, we didn't really, as a little girl, feel racism because the entire city was Black. And everywhere we went, it was Black people. I grew up with the first Black mayor. It was Black people in leadership, Black people on city council, Black people everywhere. I was born the firstborn of 6 to a teenage mom. And she, at the time that she was pregnant, it was not legal for her to remain in school. So she got pregnant in the 10th grade and she was removed from high school at that time. And at the time that she gave birth to me, we were living with my great-grandparents, who, by the way, had built their own home, had a little small coffee shop where everyone in the community would come to. My earliest memories of the environment was my great-grandmother's garden. And to this day, I love lavender because of her garden. I remember this big wraparound porch that I could just play on and then frolic with her while she was working in her garden and just smell all the pretty things that came from that. In a lot of ways, segregation protected and shielded me, actually, because in our block, you know, a Black dentist lived across the street. There were teachers, there were people on welfare. I mean, we all lived together. We were kind of protected, and it was just like this simple kind of life up until when I was about 12 years old, and my great-grandmother's house, by this time she was a widow, was on the chopping block because of eminent domain, because they were building a freeway. through the neighborhood that happened to be Black, right? And well, of course, everybody was Black, but this neighborhood that was going to really help to connect the suburbs to downtown and all the jobs. And my great grandmother had to leave her home, and she ended up relocating to California somewhere to be near my great uncle. And she died in a 1-bedroom apartment in San Diego.
Mm.
And unfortunately for us, that wealth that most white Americans can start with in terms of building wealth because they own property and that kind of stuff, that was snatched from us. By this time, my mom had married and I had all these siblings come along, and we ended up moving, and I had my first encounter with racism. And many people may remember the movie 8 Mile. 8 Mile is real because Black people never crossed 8 Mile. 8 Mile was a no-no for Black people. If you did, you was gonna be in trouble. Now, during the 67 riots, my mother and family wasn't very political. I just let you know that. But during the 67 riots, my dad and uncles and whatever really participated in that effort, which kicked off like blocks away from where we lived. And I remember this gas station exploding. And I remember a day or two later looking down the street and seeing tanks, military tanks, with their, I don't know, the nozzles, whatever you call those things, pointing at our direction. Like that was like something was amiss, right? And shortly thereafter, I remember gathering around on my father's side, my grandmother's and granddad's house, and as all the adults were gathered around the television, and people were crying and sad, and I'm thinking, as the oldest, what's wrong? What's wrong, Grandma? What's wrong? And they were crying because Martin Luther King had died. And that's the first sort of awakening about us as a people for me growing up. Like something's not right, right? So we moved from the old neighborhood, and Mom and we were able to move into this neighborhood that was transitioning right after the riots and whatever, from white to us coming in, but it was still a lot of white folks living on this particular block. She, because of my great uncle, who was a PhD out in Arizona, ultimately, he helped her buy a house. And she bought this house because by this time she was separated. My dad and mom were separated. We buy this house, we move over on this part of town. And so I enter into class and I'm seated next to a little white person, a little white boy. Had never been in a classroom with white people, but I didn't think anything of it. And that little boy had such a fit. He screamed and hollered and cried and just had a fit that this Black girl was he was being made to sit next to this Black girl. That was another sort of moment. Check, something's not right. Something's not right. Eventually, my dad died. He worked for Chrysler. He was on his way home from work one night, had a massive heart attack, and because of that, had a car crash. And we don't know. People say, well, the car accident happened and then the heart attack, but we believe it was the heart attack that caused him his ultimate death in this accident. And now my mom is a widow with 6 kids because they never divorced, right? And I remember her struggle. Like she was struggling to keep everything going, struggling to keep the house going. She did get a little, something from insurance and what have you, but we didn't have an automobile. She couldn't afford it. So we were pretty much nestled in this neighborhood and didn't go very far. But I do remember cherry trees and apple trees, and I remember grasshoppers and all those kind of things, and enjoying that part of nature. And my mom kept up with the tradition of a garden in our backyard, right? So that's how I grew up. Now, my mom was a stickler for it because she could not finish high school. She was a stickler for, you're gonna graduate high school. Now, what you do after high school, that's on you, but you're gonna graduate high school, right? So everybody graduated high school, but I had no direction about college, right? But I do know that I had sort of this burning desire to make a difference. And I remember just observing my mother and her struggle, and the fact that we lost my great grandparents' home. Things just didn't seem right to me. And though no one was kind of instructing me about justice and all of that, Mama was struggling trying to keep food on the table for us. She had a sister, my aunt, my favorite person in the whole wide world, who's no longer with us. But Aunt Fran was considered the bad egg in the family. She was a rebel, and she had moved to Flint, and she had set up her family in Flint, Michigan. And she got very active in the labor movement in Flint, Michigan. And when I remember around 12 or 13, paying attention to the conversations she would bring and have with my mom, she and my uncle. And they would talk about justice and talk about women's rights and talk about workers' rights. And I don't know, but something, she turned on the light for me, right? And I wanted to be just like my Aunt Frances. Like, that's the key. That's the answer. Something's not right. My Aunt Frances knew what it was, and I wanted to learn from her, and I did. And it eventually ended up working in the labor movement as a result of it, and the rest is history. How do I define the environment? I'm like Dr. McLean, it is where I live. It is where I worship and play, and I am educated and love. That's the environment for me. And it happens to embody the air that we breathe and the water that we drink and the playgrounds we play on, right? That's the environment for me. Similarly, I'm not sure what justice is. I remember thinking when I started the Green Door Initiative is, if environmental justice hit me in the face, would I recognize it? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What is environmental justice, right? And we fought so hard. My bio didn't include my first 15 years of working in the movement, because I started the Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice, where there we wanted to make sure that environmental justice was a household phrase and that it was something that we had to fight for and achieve. But in this moment, my thing is trying to manifest what that looks like for the people in my community, what it looks like to be able to enjoy clean air, what it looks like to be able to drink safe water and have access to affordable water, what it looks like for my children to be able to go into school buildings and not have asthma triggers, and or be on top of some kind of contaminated site because of all of the manufacturing legacies that left a bunch of dirt and mess and toxins and whatever for us to deal with, and then get blamed that our city is dirty and nasty and what's wrong with Black people kind of narrative. So I'm going to stop there because I'll be crying in a minute, thanks to you, sisters. But let you answer that next question, Katrina.
Thank you very much. So now I think we all have a sense of who you are as people and what you bring to your work. And so now I want to kind of place that first summit in a broader, I would say, historical and also I would say environmental context. So we're looking at mid 80s, moving into the late 80s, peeping into the 90s. What was the landscape of the mainstream environmental movement? And then what were communities where you were working, where you were living, what were communities facing? Let's start with, let's see. Ms. Wilkins starts off for this question.
Well, it's interesting because I said I was working in the labor movement, and at that time I was working in around occupational health and safety. And I was especially interested in that topic because of my dad passing away. Black folks were always receiving the last the worst kind of jobs and the most unhealthy and low paying kind of jobs. And he was definitely one of those folks. And at the time, we were working very closely with labor around this particular facility. They were going to build a huge incinerator. I was not thinking about the environment. All I remember is that the labor movement wanted those jobs, and there was a battle between the public workers, AFSCME union, and the construction workers, because the construction workers wanted those jobs, and AFSCME knew that they would be inside of those jobs becoming ill. And AFSCME workers, because they were city workers, were Black, and the construction workers were white folks. And the loudest voice, quite honestly, was the environmental organizations who were trying real hard to stop this facility from being built. I didn't have an opinion then because I just wasn't woke then. All I know is that they would come through the public housing facility neighborhoods, trying to get our attention, get the attention of the people in these communities to get on board with this issue. And people would look outside their doors and see these white people carrying signs and talking about stop the incinerator that our well-known, powerful mayor was advocating for, right? Like this Black mayor was advocating for this, and these white people were saying, no, it shouldn't happen. And we just saw that as a issue between white people and Black people always, white people against the mayor and the city of Detroit. So in terms of my consciousness around the environment, it was very localized, if you will. It wasn't this bigger understanding. My bigger context came from the unions and workers and trying to find ways for Black people to be safer on the job.
Dr. McLean, what were communities facing in terms of environmental issues, late 80s, peeping into the 90s? And then how did that contrast with what was being discussed or focused on in the mainstream environmental movement?
I think that in the 80s, for me, the main issues were a disarmament, anti-nuclear weapons, and apartheid. We were fighting against apartheid and all of its manifestations, including what was happening to people in the townships vis-a-vis environmental injustice issues. I was working with the American Friends Service Committee, trying to get Black people to understand, and I didn't even understand it myself, what nuclear energy was, what nuclear weapons and all of its big difficult issues related to it. That's the 80s scene. And so when the 90s came around, for us, the general movement was still very white. And we didn't use the label environmental work. We just know that we were working for good water. We were working here in Savannah around these paper companies and these chemical companies and the port and all the stuff that was happening to us. But we weren't linking it as we were environmentalists. We was just people who was being effed up, and we needed to do something about it. We couldn't breathe. We had the asthma. We had the skin diseases. We had the lowest paying jobs, and just this Sierra Club stuff. What the hell they talking about? Talking about hug some damn tree, honey. We over here about to starve to death. I don't even want to hear that shit. I just don't even want to hear it. But we were still working on those issues, and the label of people of Black people, brown people, indigenous people, we were still having that label. They're not concerned about no environment. They just over there talking about some this and they did for some civil rights. And then, oh my God, it got on my nerves. Because we were on the front line and the fence line even then. We just didn't know it. We didn't have that language, but we were in the streets, working on the ground. And oh, by the way, policy. But for Black folks, policy, what that? What that is? They didn't know that they were the drivers of what was happening to them. And so my introduction was, we got to build the capacity of our people to understand all of this and become engaged. In 1991, I think how I really got in is we woke up the day after Christmas and 20,000 picocuries of tritium, radioactive tritium, had found its way through a leak from the Savannah River site, which is 125 miles upriver. That's they say former, but it's a part of the nuclear weapons production facility, right? And so we woke up and that stuff was in the Savannah River. And they were telling us, oh boy, ain't nothing wrong with that now. You know, okay, the mayor, we had our first woman mayor, she was a Republican, and she and a representative from the Department of Energy in the Savannah Riverside had a champagne glass. They're like this one right here. And they was toasting on TV, telling, oh, that tastes so good. Ain't nothing wrong with the water. And we were like, you lying. And actually that's how we got involved with the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, because nobody, or very few, definitely no Black folks, was talking about the freaking issue of nuclear weapons and its impact on folks who live near those sites. And they had us so separated. We thought it was just the Savannah Riverside. Then we found out it was Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and it was Los Alamos in New Mexico. It was Hanford over in Washington. It was over in Colorado with Rocky Flats. It was up in Kentucky. We were like, what the heck? And that's how we got involved, because they was trying to pull the wool over our eyes and run a sham on us. And we didn't even know how to pronounce tritium. So we didn't know what it was. But those activities had been going on around rural communities across the country, and in our instance, in Georgia and South Carolina. So the landscape at that time was segregation. The white folk was over here saving the owls and the trees and the whatever. And then the Black folks were still trying to survive and to move out of surviving to thriving. And even you talk about the water, we found out that the water was contaminated with mercury. And they hadn't even put out no fish advisories. And for our people, fishing in Georgia and South Carolina, like Susanna knows, was very important. Bernice talked about the fish coming up from the South to New York. You ain't got no good fish up there. You ain't got no good fish up there. So what we had to do is try to link what was going on in our own backyard with what was going on in New York. See, I'm linked to Detroit too. I got 75 cousins up there from one woman. I got 75 first, second, third cousins. I'm linked in New York. My mama left Savannah and went to New York, went to Harlem, and then went over to Bed-Stuy, do or die. Linked with Texas. My cousin down there got a $5,600 power bill after what just happened. So all of this stuff is linked now, and it was linked then, but we just didn't know about it. But through that first People of Color Leadership Summit, somebody had a fantastic idea, and they brought these people together, and they said, enough is enough, and we finna kick some ass. We finna change the whole landscape of the environmental movement. And it ain't gonna be the environmental movement no more. It's gonna be called the environmental justice movement. That's how we got there. That's how we got there. Mm-hmm.
Ms. Almanzan, can you tell us about what you were seeing in the communities you were working with, issues people were facing? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think one of the things is, in my early times, I began in the civil rights movement, and from the civil rights movement, I go to the Brown Beret movement, and from the Brown Beret movement, I go to the Chicano movement. And so at the earlier stage, what was happening, big issues in our community was police brutality. Police oppression was a big issue. We had a lot of people getting killed by the police and being oppressed by the police. We had our housing had just gone completely down, substandard housing, because monies were not coming in. They were letting them, no banks were giving out loans to people of color to keep their houses out. Redlining was at its peak in those particular times. So we also were looking at the North American free trade agreement that was happening. The maquiladoras were going, our neighbors, our families in Mexico all being impacted, the contamination, the jobs, uh, basically sweatshops for women in the maquiladoras and the free trade agreement and what was happening there. But also looking at the whole prison system when it was also the height of every law that was coming out to imprison people of color. And people of color, were out in the fields picking cotton, working to make the capitalist system more rich. The white people who are still sort of this plantation mentality that the prisoners were their servants, their slaves. And so that was a lot that was happening because and even to today, majority are people of color, but even in worse conditions at that time that we had to be looking at that particular issue. So we were definitely being impacted by national, international trade agreements because of the cross borders and what was happening. And not only that, at that time, the high tech companies were moving. It was once thought that once they were in California, mostly in California, but they were leaving a legacy, a toxic legacy footprint. And then we began to see them move into Texas, into New Mexico, into Arizona, into Boston. And we knew now that high tech was coming in. And at that time, most of high tech had assembly lines. And who were working at the assembly lines were people of color and majority of women working with the most toxic chemicals. Here in Austin, in my community, Metropolis was being looked at as the community would become the next high tech corridor here in Austin. And so we began to organize really early. We joined forces with groups from California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Boston. We looked at one particular industry, which was Cimatech. Cimatech was a national consortium that was made of various high-tech facilities, IBM, Traycor, et cetera. But they were in competition at that time with the Japanese to build the smart bomb chip. That little chip that was going to be able to go over and decide how to bomb people. That's what, and they were getting money from the environmental defense budget at the United States. And it was our window to get in there and be able to say, we need to sit down with the chairman and the board of Cimatech and to look at alternatives, all the chemicals they were using, to the chemicals they were releasing. At the same time, taking on the fight of other industries who were trying to come in to develop that corridor and fighting, at the state level on their permits to come in, also fighting at the local level on doing, protests, press conference, getting out information, and networking with other states, getting them to come in and look at what was happening in our communities. It was a time, and that time there was a height of communications by people of color. We had grassroots newspapers. So communication was very important. And we were at that time had gotten into the radio stations, being able to get our own radio programs, to get our own information. So I thought it was a really height of mass communications, at least at the local level and then state levels that other people were having. And then I felt like when we got into the environmental justice movement, because the civil rights movement was people of color, the Chicano movement was basically Latinx, and so was the Brown Beret movement was Latinx communities. Getting into the EJ, I felt like the environmental justice movement, it was rooted on a lot of the indigenous concepts that I had grown up. It was rooted in the earth. So the environmental justice movement was rooted in the earth, but it was also rooted in people of color. It was, and we speak for ourselves. That motto was, we speak for ourselves, right? And so for me, that was something I had understood very young because I told you I lived in the Black Brown neighborhood. So finally being able to all come together and then have the native indigenous people there too, the Asians, it it was something that I'd been waiting for all my life. To me, I felt like, okay, people of color getting together, looking at the issues. And it's like somebody just said, sometimes you feel like you're the only one. Like our community was the only one here in East Austin. We were the only ones that were fighting these big giants. We had the tank farms, the biggest transnational corporations, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Citgo, all in our communities. We had the power plants in our community, all of these things. But when you got there to that national first leadership summit on EJ, you found out you weren't the only one. You found out that there were communities throughout the entire United States. And later on, we would find it through the world, right? But at that time, everyone within the United States was going basically, people of color were being impacted just about the same, with these different crises that I said, whether it was the pollution, whether it was the prison system, whether it was the trade system, the maquiladoras, substandard housing, education, all of this stuff you found at that National People of Color Summit. People who were going through the same issues as our communities and the networking. And to me, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever encountered in my life. At that time, I was 38 years old, and I've already gone through this whole movement. I started organizing when I was in high school, organizing against the lettuce boycott for the farm workers for Cesar Chavez, fighting because I finally got to a non-segregated school, but it was practically segregated because we didn't have representation on student council. We weren't able to participate in extracurricular activities because they had a high point average. So we came from substandard education to people who had high quality education. So we got to see what the problem was. So I was organizing already in high school. I've been organizing for about 52 years now. But the environmental justice movement was something that touched my very heart and my very soul, because it included all people of colors. And it was not to say we were excluding white people, but we were being inclusive. We were being inclusive because in the white circles, we had always been excluded. We had always been, and if we were the afterthought. But in the people of color, it was about inclusiveness. It was about how do we work together? How do we network? How do we exchange ideas? How do we support one another? And to me, that was the beauty and continues to be the beauty of the environmental justice movement, and us all coming in together, but rooted in Mother Earth.
Bernice, could you share a little bit about the communities you were working with, what you were facing, and then your experiences of the mainstream environmental movement up to that point?
Well, it's always a dislocating thing to live in New York City, right? Because New York City is the centerpiece of so much of industrial power, political power. Certainly the financial system is, headquartered on Wall Street. The communications systems, philanthropy, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and so many others. Almost all the mainstream environmental organizations, the Natural Resources Defense Council, where I used to work, the Environmental Defense Fund, National Wildlife Federation, and the Audubon Society, and so many others, either were headquartered in New York City, in Manhattan, or certainly had offices there, Sierra Club. They might as well have been operating in the Arctic Circle because they had no relationship to our communities whatsoever. And we had no idea that they existed. Zero, nada, none. There was no connection between them and us. None. And in fact, we were we had a giant sewage treatment plant was built on the west side of our community on the Hudson River. Was originally supposed to be built where what is now the Lincoln Center, Metropolitan Opera, New York City Ballet, where that is located, is right behind it on the riverfront, is where the sewage treatment plant was supposed to be built. And Robert Moses the great racist, anti-Semitic architect of so much of what is New York City, determined that he did not want a facility such as a sewage treatment plant to be near what he was calling, and the city was calling, the West Side Improvement Project. Long story short, they decided to move it uptown without any consent, without any discussion, without any public notice, to start building the sewage treatment plant on the edge of our community to help clean up that filthy Hudson River that I had mentioned earlier. If you want to get a really bird's eye view of what was going on in the community at the time, you should see this movie called Claudine, which many of you have probably seen, with James Earl Jones and Diane Carroll. And he was a sanitation worker, and every day his truck would go to the Marine Transfer Station, which was on 135th Street and the Hudson River waterfront, or 12th Avenue. And that was the first polluting facility in the community. And because it was already there, they built the sewage treatment plant right adjacent to it. And then there were highways and byways that dissected our communities, and transportation routes, a subway system, trains that were underground in the white communities would come above ground on above ground tracks in the Black and Latino communities. So we were just bombarded by every kind of environmental assault that you can imagine. We were a textbook case of where you didn't want to live, what you didn't want to live next to, and how you didn't want your children to have to live like that. And so for some reason, we stumbled across this information. Every junior high school, every middle school in Northern Manhattan was built next to a bus depot. There are 7 municipal bus depots, I think there are 8 now, in Manhattan. 7 of them are in Northern Manhattan, right, where the Black and brown people were. So we have particulate pollution. We had abnormally high asthma rates. Everybody always had asthma when I was growing up. I was fortunate and I did not have asthma, but everybody else in my class always had asthma. It was a huge issue for us, and nobody could put their hands on it until we started doing the organizing that we did for West Harlem Environmental Action. It was a difficult place to be from an environmental standpoint, but yet just south of us, well, first of all, next door to us, were very affluent communities. So New York is a really odd bird like that. Our zip code, which was 10035, was one of the poorest zip codes in the entire United States at the time. Adjacent to us is the Upper East Side of Manhattan, the Silk Stocking District, right? Which is one of the most affluent zip codes in the entire United States of America, has always been. And so there was that poverty and that affluence jammed right next to each other. And so as Black and brown people, you would get on buses. So if you see that movie Claudine, Diane Carroll is a maid in that movie. And she gets on a bus in Harlem, and the bus travels uptown, and it goes to the Bronx, to a neighborhood called Riverdale, which is, you know, people think of the Archie comics and think it's a made up place. No, it is one of the most affluent communities in the United States of America. And it's right there in the Bronx. The same Bronx that holds the South Bronx also holds Riverdale, right? And so that juxtaposition is all over New York City. And as people of color, your face is ground in it every day. This ain't for you, right? We want you to clean the offices. We want you to run the trains. We want you to be the nurses at the hospitals. Every hospital, all the nurses are Black and brown, all of them, right? Has always been so in New York City, but they're not the doctors. They run the dietary departments. They're the backbone of the school system, but they're not the principals, right? And when I was growing up, they weren't even the teachers. I had 3 Black teachers from kindergarten to 12th grade, 3 Black teachers in a city that was majority people of color then and now. So it was just in your face all the time. And so, but I'm fortunate, as I said earlier, that social movement was everywhere when I was growing up, everywhere. Now, nobody ever talked about environmental issues because the way environment was conceptualized did not center people of color or any of the issues that touched our lives ever, right? And so we had to do, as Susanna said, one of the most beautiful things about the First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit is that we didn't take somebody else's platform and say, how can we twist it and frame it and mold it to make it our platform? We built our own ship, right? To free ourselves. We weren't dependent on anybody else. We did it for ourselves. And we're still doing it for ourselves. And I have no regrets ever. I will never regret that. That was the move that we took. We defined ourselves. We defined what environment meant to us. We defined our principles of environmental justice. We defined our call to action. We said how we were going to go home and work and organize at the local level and the regional level. We said what we were going to do. And guess what? We did it. We didn't have no money. We didn't have any political power, but that didn't stop us from having a vision of transforming what we meant by environment and what the environmental movement was. And we brought to life something that no one else had ever thought to talk about. All these people doing all this environmental work, right? Passing environmental laws, 800 miles away from us in New York State, on the western edge of New York State, were people throwing down that created the Superfund program. Now, people like to say all the time that we are informed as a movement by what was going on in upstate New York. And I'm here to tell you we were not. There is no relationship whatsoever between, that was great organizing that a great group of white folks did to defend the interests of the people who lived in a subdivision where they lived, where they found out it was built on top of contaminated land. But walking distance from that subdivision was public housing with Black and brown people. Nobody ever moved them from where they lived, right? So there was great work going on, but it didn't have anything to do with us. And so we had to speak for ourselves. We had to envision for ourselves, and we had to bring to life what we needed to do to save ourselves. And we're still doing it.
Okay, now I want to drill down to the actual planning of the summit. So my first question, Bernice, we'll start with you and then we'll move backwards. How did this actual event come about? What was the idea one day? Who was sitting having breakfast, having coffee? How did this all come to be? And then specifically, what was the framework and how do you go through organizing who has to be in this space? The actually building of these several
Love
days.
Canal. Thank you, Donnell. Love Canal. So there may be some people out here who disagree with this, but I'm just going to say what Vernice knows from Vernice's perspective. There was a person who is still very much alive named Charles Lee. And Charles is a master planner and a master organizer. He works for US EPA now. But Charles thought that we needed to have a bigger conversation. We needed, and the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, where Charles worked at the time as the research director with Reverend Dr. Ben Chavis and other extraordinary human beings who were a part of the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. They were connected to the movement in Warren County, North Carolina, which was largely set in motion by members of the United Church of Christ there in Warren County, North Carolina. And you'd have to ask Charles exactly what was he thinking, but whatever he was thinking, it was, we got to move this conversation into a bigger space. And it was Charles and people who are working with Charles and in conversation with many of us around the country who were now beginning to have some conversations, at least with the UCC, that said, you know, we need all to be in one space. And I felt just like Susanna. We had no idea that there were so many people who were in a similar situation to what we were. So we put together a planning committee. There was a planning committee that included the person who was the president of the United Church of Christ at the time, who himself was Korean. There was Dana Alston, an extraordinary human being, philanthropist and strategist. There was Bob Bullard, Ben and Charles, of course. I'm trying to think who else was on that core planning committee. that original co-chairs planning committee. And then they asked all of us to serve on the planning committee to help build out the summit and to mobilize and bring people from wherever we were. And we met several times to lay out the agenda. And as you could see, or maybe you can't see, this is my original copy of the proceedings from the First National People of Color Summit. It has, let me see, how many pages? Has about 250 pages of workshops, strategy sessions, meetings, late night conversations, capturing the conversations that went on to build that what would become the national platform. But it was also thanks to our late brother Damu Smith. We also had culture, right? And I'm sure that Mildred had something to say about that we wouldn't just get together, and I don't mean to offend anybody by what I'm about to say, but when you bring a whole bunch of people of color together, you cannot just have a conversation. You must have food. You must have spirituality. You must have music. You must have theater and spoken word. We had all of that, right? In 4 days, I don't know how we did all of the things that we did, but we had a young people's poetry, spoken word thing. We had music. We had banquet after banquet after banquet. We never did so much eating, right? We had celebration time, but we worked our tails off. So, and I think we've lost a bit of that in our work. We are so intense about the work that we forget about the celebration, right? And what we did at the summit was both a drive an agenda, conceptualize a social movement, but we also had a lot of damn fun.
Dr. McLean, can you talk a little bit about the building out of those days, of those sessions that Bernice just mentioned? So as part of the planning, the importance of culture, who had to be there. Talk a little bit about that planning.
Well, I don't have a lot of background because I came into the planning process late. The first meeting I attended was in New Orleans. And in that meeting, that planning committee meeting was my first toxic tour of Cancer Alley. And we were shown the devastation and the real deep impact of living around refineries and chemical companies, the whole chemical corridor, Cancer Alley, all of that. And what it did for us is it put an imprint in our brain, but more so in our spirit. Because see, the brain will get tired, but the spirit never tires. So it'll drag your butt where you don't even want to go. But at that planning committee, what was important, that planning committee meeting that was important, is it integrated the folks who were dealing with nuclear facilities into the process. Because prior to that, it was really around those other issues, landfills, municipal dumps, bus depots, all of that stuff. But there was just a little talk about the impact on community by nuclear weapons production. And so at that meeting, it became a full body of work. Yeah. And it included folks who lived around those 13 facilities that are known as the federal facilities complex throughout the country. And it also began to, this had been prior, but it began to mushroom because part of my soapbox is the inclusion of young people. So you cannot have the kind of work that needs to be done if you got just one generation. And so we began to talk about, and it manifested itself even deeper in the second People of Color Leadership Summit, where the youth had a whole dedication section to themselves. They had their own planning committee, their own resources, but it was at the first one where that groundwork was laid. So the stakeholders who were dealing with federal facilities issues, the indigenous tribes that was dealing with the radiation stuff, those communities who had the intersection between the exposure from chemicals and refineries and water and all of that, and then these nuclear big things that we didn't know nothing about. And again, the inclusion, the more inclusion of Deep South, the deep Southerners, because, you know, often y'all think we can't talk and we can't cipher and we can't do all of that there. And y'all, so you leave, we're going to speak for y'all. But they said, no, 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 no. We have people on the ground who are working. And so resources have to be allocated to ensure that people from the deep South, the Gulf Coast, as well as the Southeast Coast, the Geechee Gullah communities had to be included in what was going down, because often, you know, you talk about the Republicans and the Democrats, and Malcolm told you they was all just Dixiecrats. So a lot of the policy stuff was coming out of these old boy networks out of the South. So the summit made sure that resources were set aside to make sure that folks from Georgia and South Carolina and Florida and Alabama and Mississippi, and, you know, well, we already had Louisiana in because of Dr. Bullitt and Dr. Wright, but that's the sections or the sectors that had to be brought in. That's when we came in. So from that point on, the planning included workshops and sessions on nuclear weapons, but in the principles, that's where the rubber meets that road. In the principles, in the preamble of the 17 environmental justice principles, we acknowledge this whole history and legacy of the nuclear weapons impact and that radiation on people, indigenous, Black, brown, and poor whites, because we didn't leave them out. See, often we are given a real bad rap. Oh, y'all just for the people of color. Y'all just, no, we wasn't. We were for everybody who was being impacted, because everybody was being impacted, including them rich white people. Because poisoners don't know no bound to get here. Oh no, y'all rich and white, we ain't going over there. And the other thing that we did was I don't know if it was a whole day or half a day, but it was some day when we met with the allies. You know, we did our thing. We were speaking for ourselves. We was developing them principles, developing them strategies. But we knew that we could not go that alone, that we had to have relationships and interconnections with the white folks with the money, and the white folks with the name, and the white folks with the power, and the white folks with the assets. But we had to make sure that they were principled, that they just weren't coming in to bring us in because we need the colored folks right now. It wasn't that kind of party. It was an authentic, let's throw down, kick butt, and come out with principles that all of us can support and champion. And so that, for me, was the most important part of the first summit, is that it tried to be as inclusive and as equitable as possible, at the same time exercising our right to self-determination and demanding respect because we were saying it, and to have you be satisfied when you wasn't in the room. Because, you know, sometimes when you ask people to leave the room, they get kind of something. But they were, some of them was kind of antsy. But for the most part, what I witnessed is that they were actually pretty happy, because their thinking had gone to hit a wall. And with the summit, new ideas, new solutions, new approaches was coming out. And they was like, from people of color, oh my gosh, you can strategize. So, you know, I like to have a little fun with all of this history, because it was some very serious work. And people had some knockdown, drag out fights, even within, say, the Black community. Because there were some people who were pro-nuclear. We were like, what? Yeah, that was a group that was like, Blacks for nukes. What the hell wrong with you? What's wrong with you? So we had that struggle, and we were rooted in, yes, we're going to start from a point of unity, and we may criticize and struggle, but we're going to end with unity. And that was the uniqueness, that we're going to walk away from here with a unified strategy. And Dana Austin told us, you got to go back and double up on organizing, because there's not enough people. And you got to create networks, because there's power in numbers. and power in different sectors working together. Because we thought we was already doing a hell of a job. But she said, whoa. Let's get some homework. Y'all got to go back and do some stuff. And then let's keep on moving. We got to check in with each other. How's this going? How's this going? So we had a plan. And like Vernice said earlier, we did the darn thing. There's a question that says, okay, well, if y'all did all of that stuff, why are they still polluting? There's victories and then there are victories. But this is a protracted struggle. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon. And you get setups and setbacks. But we are spiritual people. And we know that ultimately, like the saying is, Harambe, let's pull together. We know when we pull together, in unity, there's strength, there's power. Yeah, we got a lot of work to do, but we've laid the groundwork for the next generations to build on. We don't have to pass the baton, we're gonna share it. Because when we win this victory, everybody's gonna shout hallelujah. And everybody will be at the table. But the summit laid that groundwork that you can bring everybody to the table, even with different and divergent thinking, and still come up with a set of principles that most human beings can live by. And the one thing I'll end with is, we didn't just stop national. We were thinking international even then. We didn't know how we was gonna do it, but we were thinking internationally even then. And I want to take my hat, my gele off and say thanks to Vernice Miller, Travis. When she was at the Ford Foundation, she insisted that a part of her portfolio was set aside to ensure that Indigenous, Brown, and Black people could continue to push this notion around environmental justice globally. And they didn't treat us like no stepchildren. They treated us with enfranchisement. They pulled us out of the slums, and we went first class all the way to the prep comms, to the side meetings, and to the real meetings. That is history that people need to know about. That the Ford Foundation, under the leadership of that sister right there named BMT, and she didn't take no one or two peoples. She took a bunch of peoples, and it was intergenerational, because we had some old folks, some middle-aged folks, and some young folks, because we got a brother right now who is knee-deep in the movement because Vernice allowed him to have a ticket to South Africa. He was a high school student. That's what the People of Color Summit did for us. It opened multi-dimensions of organizing and mobilizing. It opened many dimensions of access to power. And that's why we are able at this particular time to do what we're getting ready to do. And that's to push these policies in such a way that you won't be able to overturn them no more. I don't care who come in the White House, because it's gonna be our house from now on. Now, you used to just whistle that, but we know it's gonna be our house from now on. That's how we gonna do it. Because what? We done trained up them children. Them children know now. They know how to hit the streets. They know how to do research. They know how to collect data. They know about strategies. They know about tactics. They ready. And if we're there to mentor, and y'all excuse me, I ain't meant to get off, but that's an ancestor done jump up in my head and tell me to tell y'all that hey, we about to do it. And what we're doing is based on what y'all already done. So there's no reason for us to feel like, oh, we ain't did nothing, we ain't got no victories, they still polluting us. Okay, that's okay. The world still goes around and around and around. We had poverty since this world hit. But guess what? There's a way out of it. And we are on the verge of doing the darn thing. Excuse me, y'all, for taking too much time.
Before we get to questions from our attendees, I want to touch on two key points from the summit that you mentioned. The creation, development of the principles, what that looked like. And then I want to talk about Dana Alston's influence and her speech, that really kind of groundbreaking moment. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of the principles. How were they developed within the space of those couple of days? Were they presented at the very end? Were they presented gradually over the course of the days? What was the initial response? And then how did you take those principles back to the communities? And then secondly, Dana Alston's speech, the content of that speech, why it was so groundbreaking, and then what were the ramifications of that moment. So Susanna, do you want to start us off in terms of the development of the principles, the reactions at the summit, the
Yeah.
principles? Yeah.
Well, there had been a committee that had been working on the principles of environmental justice, but they weren't complete. And so at the summit, I had the honor of working on the final and tweaking. And believe me, it was to 3 or 4 in the morning. Not it was a long process because words do mean things. And so because we were working with a lot of the indigenous different native groups, it was real important with the wordsmithing that we made sure that we got the words right. And that's why I say words do matter, words do count. And so in writing the principles of environmental justice and then having to go um, before the committee to sort of like approving or ratifying the principles of environmental justice, and then taking it to the body um, uh, for getting everybody's blessings on the principles of environmental justice. And I think that those principles itself were so powerful. And when you have, because the summit, the leadership summit was, they looked at, it was multiracial, but it was also representation, regional wise, representation, and even from Alaska and other tribal nations coming in. There was also the gender issue, and then there was youth. So when all the planning, it was making sure that we had all of this, that all of these people from different areas, different gender and youth, multiracial, were going to be there at that summit. So that was very important. But the principles of environmental justice, they were the guiding principles, the guiding principles that people have been working under, that some groups have been doing. It's not like it wasn't, but when you get down and you put it together, so you solidify it and you work in solidarity so that it becomes everybody's principle, that it becomes a path for everyone to work on, that is historical in itself. And even today, when I go to certain meetings in certain places, people bring the principles of environmental justice. They bring the humanist principles, but it was the principles of environmental justice that was first, adopted, whatever you want to call it, approved, got the blessings from the multiracial, multi-regional, gender, youth group of people who came together and said those would be our principles that we are adopting. Now, one of the important things that I remember from Dana Austin was not just about us going back and organizing, but speaking to the truth about the funding and the resources, about how foundations were trying to decide what our movement was going to be like. At that time, there was a big argument because funders were trying to get rid of the elders. Funders were beginning to say, you know what, those elder people of color, they need to move out of the way to make room for the next generation. Little did the funders know that our cultures were intergenerational and that we don't throw our elders away. Our elders are what keep the balance. There are the balance. There are shared wisdom and knowledge that we cannot dispense of. And so when we think about, people of color and the cultures of how we view our elders, there's no someone that we just cast to the side and they're no longer of any value. And that was a big fight. And I think what Dana was bringing forward was that we can't let the funders try and determine what our issues are, and that we have to hold the funders accountable because they were not giving the funds to communities of color, not at the rate that they were funding the white groups. It never has, it to this day is improved, but it's not where it's supposed to be. Because I always look at it, there's a war going on and people of color are at the front line. We're the frontline communities, but the people writing about our war are getting the money. and we don't have the money. We're at the front line and we should have the resources. And the foundations that got it all wrong. The other things you said, the foundation were trying to determine what issues we would be working on. One thing was trying to get rid of the elders. The second one was trying to lead where they wanted us to be, and you see it all the time. Okay, this year is sustainability. Their interpretation of a sustainability is always different from people of color interpretation, just like the environment. We redefine it. Sustainability, how do we sustain ourselves in place? Not just how we sustain plants and how we build buildings. It's about people again. But again, Dana Austin I felt she really brought that to the forefront of the inequities, of the imbalance, of how foundations were trying to set the pace and how they were trying to separate again people of color, communities, organizations, and families, and how it was important that we go back and organize, continue to organize in our communities, continue to do the things, because I think most people of color organization, they were already intergenerational. They weren't just all older people running or all young. No, it was families, because you organize families. That's what our whole concept has always been, families. Whether you take your little ones to the meetings, like my kids would say, well, they would call this, the meetings that really start there is in the parking lot when they get ready to leave. They're still out for another hour. They would always complain, that meeting's never over, Mom. It continues in the parking lot, so they always know that. And I'm sure the kids all over, they would have the same conversation about their parents and the leadership. But I think that was, to me, the first People of Color Summit, Leadership Summit, was about making sure it was multiracial, intergenerational, all the regional different representations from all the areas, that we also had the gender and the youth. And I think that was the beauty. And not to say that we didn't have heavy discussions, because we did. And that's only the right way to do it. It's just like in the family. You will always have these discussions. It's only natural. But that's how we learn from one another, right? And that's how we share things with one another, is by having those real heavy discussions, like Mildred said, on nuclear. Those are things that, but there are a lot of issues. The mining was a big issue in a lot of the indigenous tribal areas, the mining and the contamination of arsenic, mercury. And then you go down, oh, there's our mercury also in the water, in the fish. The people couldn't eat the fish anymore, and stuff like that. So there was a lot of commonalities. But I think in having that leadership summit and having the speakers who were able to really, portray the bigger issue, right? Because it's true, as we go on, and like Mildred said, and Bernice, is that this was just the beginning. And there was a lot of networks, coalition that we have even to today. Some of them have, of course, because of resources and other issues, they don't exist. But that doesn't mean we don't have communications with certain individuals and groups that continue to meet. And it was true that we were able to then talk about environmental racism in the conference on racism and all kinds of isms in Africa. It was, how do we work together to make sure that we got, environmental justice to the repertoire so they could write it up. Whether it was going to the women's conference in China, how do we make sure that the people of color issues went to the forefront? When we went to Brazil, how do we make sure at that climate summit that the people of color issues were there? And that's why I think it was important that we went from grassroots to national to international, to be able, like Mildred said, it was a world issue and we all had the same issues. And we see that even today, the displacement that is happening in our local communities and the displacement that is happening throughout the world due to all the capitalism and the greed that is happening. People are having to move, not because they want to, but because they're having to, whether it's climate change or whether it's the capitalist system that is taking away the land from a lot of indigenous people throughout the world. We see that happening at the local level, but we also see it at the world level. And I think that that's why the summit, the summit really brought a lot of people together, and it really continues from that time on even to today, in which we know the next generation, because I know my grandchildren and other grandchildren, now they're working together. And that's the real beauty of it. And they're networking with other grandchildren from other states and regions. And so that's a real beauty of people of color coming together to really organize and really work together on these issues. And yes, we're not solving all the pollution. There's no way. But when you talk about 500 years of them messing up this, our this planet, Mother Earth, and it's only been a while since we've really been working to fight it. It's gonna take generations to do it. But just look at it. A lot of things have changed. And there's been a lot of victories. And it's taken a lot of struggle and sometimes people dying in that struggle. And that's what we really have to remember, is that we've lost a lot of people. A lot of our people have died to all kinds of cancer due to contamination, all the pollution, everything that's happened. And we have to continue that struggle to make sure that our world is safe and continues to be safe for 7 generations and more.
So we have 4 or 5 questions. Before we do that, maybe go by 5 minutes. So just ask your patience. I really want to speak a little bit about Dana and her speech, and to see how many of you were actually in the room when she gave that speech, how that impacted you. We'll start with Ms. Wilkins, but also because I think it's important to know the consequences are the ramifications of her giving that speech in that moment. Okay, so Donna, talk a little bit about being in the room and hearing what she had to say and what was going on around you when she spoke those truths.
First of all, it was fire. I remember sitting like near the front. I don't know how we managed to get there. The crew that came with me from Detroit, but we were in the sort of the front of one of those areas in the room. It was fire because it was at that moment, her speech. We had just finished our work. I was among the participants who were working, through the night and whatever with our little subcommittees trying to get this work done for the principals. And so our work was done, and now we were coming in this room for her to give us sort of our orders, right? And this sister, I didn't know anything about her or whatever. It was that moment that her words for me defined what I was going to do with my life. I was young, I was sitting there, and I'm like, I know what I'm going to do with my life. I am going to dedicate my life to environmental justice. I know this is what I was born to do. And it, for me, and I know it did, it lit a fire under everyone. She said, go back to your communities and start a movement. I took it serious. We came back to Detroit. Many of the folks that I met in that meeting, we had just kind of met for the first time. I didn't know them before I left Detroit. All I know is that we started meeting in my house. And then before you know it, we created Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice from that. And and that's history, and that, was written. But she put the flame. She told us that it was our responsibility, that now we were equipped and we needed to go back. And I'm going to tell you, the light came on for me. I was working in the labor movement when I came to this meeting. And if you look at number 8 of the EJ principles and the proceedings, they named me because I was the one pushed to the front to read that and say, this is the recommendation for workers and environmental justice, right? So I'm a little piece of the history there. But we came back, and it was like, I told the people I was working for, I was like, I need to do this. I need to do whatever I can to get environmental justice work done in Detroit. And they were like, and I was working for all these white folks. I was the only Black person and only person of color working with this group. It was a COSH group, Coalition on Occupational Safety and Health. Folks may know them. But this group pretty much said, Donnell, whatever you need, you can have it. If you need to use the Xerox machine, whatever you need to have meetings, whatever, right? I just know that it put a flame, it started something, and the fire just connected across the country. And I'm grateful to have been a part of that, because I can't even imagine what my life would be like today if I did not have this purpose-driven role to make it better for people in my community and to connect across the country, to lift up our voices in a collective way, to make a difference. And now we got the President of the United States of America speaking out of his mouth that environmental justice is a priority. That's the work of the people you have in this collection, and others. It's just regular folk. So anybody who say we didn't have power, we had power. We didn't recognize our power.
That's right.
That's all. We didn't recognize it. And then we got work to do, but we done done a lot. And I don't want to ignore what we have done to make it, get us closer to that and to that goal. And it is one of those, we hand over the baton, when it's the next group's job to take it to the next level. But that's what it did for me.
So Katrina, I want to just connect these two moments. So there was a group of people, starting with Susanna Almanza, myself, David Harrison, an Indigenous Alaskan brother, Kikanza Ramsey, a student who was 19 years old, Isaiah Madison from Sojourners Magazine, Mia Yoshitani, another student who was 19 or 20 years old, is now the executive director of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Ralph Rivera, and chaired by former New Mexico Governor Tony Anaya. That was the drafting committee that wrote the principles of environmental justice and presented it to our 400 delegates, who then debated it into the wee hours. But we were in a little room off the main ballroom, and that's where we were for 4 days. So there were like 2 parallel events going on, but they were right next to us in the big grand ballroom of the Washington Court Hotel. And when Dana gave her speech, so all those people I just read out, we were locked in that room together for hours on end. We would come out for meals, but we essentially were in that room working on the principles of environmental justice. But when Dana gave her speech, we heard, it was like a revival, a religious revival. People were shouting, people were screaming, people were clapping, people were stomping. You heard people running up and down the aisles. It was literally like a religious revival when everybody got the Holy Ghost all at one time, because what Dana was saying was speaking to people's souls. So right before we went into that session, we had a luncheon. And on the way out of the luncheon, myself, Peggy Shepard, Jean Sindab, and a few other people from New York ran into Dana in the hallway as we were moving from the luncheon to come back into this area where she was going to give this talk. And she stopped us and she said, "I need y'all to pray for me." And we said, "Okay." And she said, "No, I mean, right this minute, I need you to pray for me." So we held hands and we prayed, but we didn't know what we were praying for. She said, "I'm about to give this talk and I don't know how it's going to go, but I just need some prayer to wash over me as I come to do this." So Jean Sindab, our beloved Jean Sindab, had come from the World Council of Churches in Geneva and was now working, she was then working at the National Council of Churches. And so Jean led us in prayer around Dana. And then Susanna and I and our crew went back into our little ante room and continued to do our work. And they were all in this big room. And Dana starts giving this talk. And I'm telling you, the Spirit of God manifests in that room at that time. And the spirit of the ancestors, she invoked everything. She said everything out loud that we had all been thinking, right? But we were not actually in the room, Susanna and I, and we could hear it through the walls. And I'm like, what in the name of God is going on over there, right? And it wasn't until I saw the video from the summit to see that Dana was up there giving the speech, and she knew she was speaking out loud against a whole bunch of taboos. She talked about debt for nature swaps. That was a whole agenda of one of the big national and international environmental organizations. And she called that out. She called out the defense industry. She called out the chemical manufacturers. She called out philanthropy. She called out the big green. She called everybody out. Now, Dana was not like me, one of my dearest friends, but not at all the same personality, though she too was from Harlem. Dana was soft-spoken. She was very intentional. She was very thoughtful. She listened more than she talked. But she must have been keeping that in her for her whole life, because she said everything that we had all wanted to say. And the response from the audience was unbelievable. It was rapturous. It was incredible to hear that through a wall, right? Well, after the summit, Dana, I see we dropped into the chat the publication that Dana wrote when she worked at the Panos Institute at the time, We Speak for Ourselves. Several of the major environmental organizations who she had called out, she didn't call them out by name. She called out the practices that they were engaged in, like Debt for Nature. You didn't have to say who the organization was. We all knew who was all over the Amazon doing Debt for Nature swaps. Ain't nobody asked them to, but we all knew who it was, right? Well, they called the funders of the Panos Institute to try to get her fired, right? How dare she come into their sacred white space and call them out? And then, as God would have it, the next year, David became the program officer for the environment at the Public Welfare Foundation, and they all had to come begging, hat in hand, to her table, right? Even though they tried to get her fired. So when we say we have built this with our own sweat and blood, you have no idea the battles that we have fought. You have no idea what Mildred has been doing with the freaking Defense Department, okay? The Defense Department. Y'all just don't hear me. That's the big thing. That's the stuff nobody writes about, but they control everything, right? And she's been fighting with them for decades. And every bit of progress we've made is because of the connection of all those people all over the country and globally to take to task the people who produce nuclear power and use radiant to do that, and uranium, right? Connecting those conversations. Dana put that on Front Street, and then we went out and did it, right? She called the green groups to task. What's up with y'all? Why are you so white, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with white people. We love white people, right? But really, half the world's population or more are people of color. Half the population in this country are people of color. How come they're not visible in your organization? She made people uncomfortable, very soft-spoken, right? I mean, you had to really hush yourself so you could hear her talking. And she laid it all out, and we are still working that agenda. We miss her more than we can say. We miss her so much, but we do this work in her honor, right? We do this work in her honor.
Can I just take an elder's prerogative for a second? One of the things that happened to most people during that speech was a conversion, was a transformation, because all of what both Donnell and Bernice have said. So many people cried. They was jumping and shouting and hallelujah, but there was a lot of quiet people just sobbing and crying, because it was like another coming of the Christ, where they saw a glimpse of, ooh, this is something new that we can do. But I want to draw your attention to the personal plight that many women of color go through in this movement to do this work. Because in doing the work, we sometimes forget the tremendous burden that our bodies are carrying in the fight. And we are sick physically, but we put that aside to march on for the greater good. That is a story of every woman on this panel. But with Dana at that time, it was even deeper, because we had been in prayer with her around a personal health issue, which she put aside. For the greater good. And that's often how we win, at the sacrifice of our bodies, to be able to speak for ourselves and speak on behalf of the people, because there's so many thousands of nameless people who are behind these movements. You'll never know them and you'll never see them. From the person who cooked the fried chicken so we can have some food, to the person who bring the cups, to the person who bring Miss Mamie, Pookie Bubba and them to the meeting. You'll never know who they are. But she spoke about those people. And she said we had a task to do to go back. And out of that, for the South, the African American Environmental Justice Action Network was born, because we took our orders seriously. Why do I raise the personal issue? Because often we don't talk about that. And she spoke of it very gently, and a lot of people missed it, of the sacrifice that women have to make in a male-led, dominated, many times, movement out front, because it's the women in the back that be still carrying on the work. So a part of what the summit did was to lift up the work of the nameless. Nobody knew Mildred McLean. I ain't hardly knew her. But I definitely didn't know in this context. But Dana pulled me aside. She said, you got a tremendous task. Because to fight the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy is almost like suicide. And I'm a witness to tell you. You deal with these CEOs at the industries and the refineries and the oil companies, everything, baby. But when you come up against the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy, you got something on your hands. But she said we had to do it. So I'll end with this. For the young people who are on this webinar, you have a tremendous task before you, because you have to carry on the work that has been started. But you have to work with us, because we ain't going nowhere. That's your challenge. We ain't going nowhere. We're going to be right here working with you, because we want to see the other side of victory as well. Like Susanna said, I want to know what environmental justice look like. Like Donnell said, I want to know what environmental justice look like if it knocked me on my door. I want to know, Vernice, what it looked like if it came to Savannah. Because I ain't seen it yet, but I know I'm going to see it. And it's our responsibility to continue to connect what's going on in Texas and Detroit and New York and Maryland with what's going on in Panama and the Bahamas and Cuba and South Africa. Those places, we have to keep this internationally, because when we brought environmental justice to the international, nobody even heard of no environmental justice, but when we described it and say, oh, that's going on. Yeah, we got that shell is in our neighborhood, polluting our waters and our rivers. So those two things, intergenerational and international. And we owe it to Dana Austin for putting aside some health stuff to deliver that speech. And that's a speech that will continue to resound in the movement when we dead and gone, because of its power. And no, we have not stopped pollution, but we damn sure done reduced it. I'm a living witness, because in Savannah, my communities live right there in 17 facilities and the port. And just the other day, I got a call from an elder. And she said, I'm so proud of what y'all have done in the last 15 years on our behalf. She said, thank you. That's the kind of reward you'll get when an elder will tell you, well done, you good and faithful servant, well done. You got a crown in heaven. That's my elder's prerogative.
So I want to get to a couple of the questions, if you'll give us a couple more minutes. And then we'll save the chat and we'll reach out to our attendees as well. We can forward some of their questions to you all and have you answer via email if you're willing to do so. So question from Cynthia Purifoy. For greater emphasis on environmental justice, is it time for another People of Color Summit? If so, how would it be different? So who wants to take this question? Is it time for another summit? And how would it be different? Or how would it be the same?
I think it would be, I would start just by saying, I would support another summit. I think it's been a long time. The time has come. I think it will be about lessons learned and strategies to take it to the next level. But I believe, given the pandemic, given the issues of racial, uprisings of late, and all of that is still in our face. The same enemy is what it is, and if we don't address systemic racism and address the policies and systems that are in place to keep the status quo, we are going to just keep spinning around. So I think we need to just take a moment and acknowledge that, and then really be deliberate and intentional about where we need to aim our targets. Aim our spears for that target. I'll stop there.
We need another summit, but the second summit was not our high water mark. And so our planning, I think that, and the difference I think was the planning, right? The exquisite planning that went on for the first People of Color Summit. We thought about everything and we tried to plan for every eventuality. And we had the United Church of Christ to serve as a central organizing force, right? But the resource question that Dana talked about then, and that is, I think, an even bigger issue now than it was then. People are grossly under-resourced. So who's going to fund this thing? It should be us funding it, right? But where are the resources that we have to draw on? It's like the Black Convention in '72, right? We put that on. And it's like when the Brown Berets came together to talk strategy, they raised their own money to do that, right? And the Black Panther Party and women's rights, et cetera, et cetera. We have to self-finance, which is really hard to say when your people are struggling for their very lives the way we are right now. Of course, we always been doing that, but we're doing it at a really uniquely challenging moment now. So the resource question sort of is connected to the next People of Color Summit or whatever that next conversation is. But we do need it because we need to think about what do we want to accomplish for the next 30 to 50 years, and how do we want to position young folks to take that leadership role and move this conversation forward. There's just so much we need to talk about. But at the end of the day, we need to talk about why our lives are still so devalued that people don't think we should have the basics like clean drinking water, clean air, places to live that are free of lead and asbestos and all the other things that we live with, the toxic waste sites, the dumps, all of that is still where we are. And so in this moment, when people seem to recognize racial violence, right? You know, the great awakening, right? That so many people are having all over the country. We cannot go back to what used to be, accepting our degradation as if that's the cost of living in a capitalist society and you just got to grin and bear it. We've been grinning and bearing it. And in this COVID moment, in this syndemic of racist violence, environmental threats, a global pandemic, it is showing everybody who ever doubted the truthfulness of what we're talking about. We have lived in this syndemic forever. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm so damn tired of this, right? So I want to go forward. It's time for the vision again, for people to see our vision and get behind us as we move us into the next level of whatever this is going to be, coming out of this nonsense that we're in now. You see, everybody's talking about it. Climate justice, environmental justice, systemic racism. Talk is cheap. Live in those values and changing and transforming the places where we live and where we work and where we worship and where we recreate. That has got to be the focus going forward. It's just got to be. And we owe it to the young people behind us. We owe it to them, and we owe it to this earth to do better than we've been doing. Because at this rate, we're going to take it all to hell in a handbasket with us if we don't stop the nonsense of how we've been living. And the universe is telling us, y'all are foul. Y'all are living foul. Now you got to correct. And it's and we have the vision. Everybody needs to get behind and follow the vision.
I would say, yes, we definitely need a third summit. And at its core, it should be, how are we going to dismantle 500 years, just to say 500 years of racism,
Yeah,
and white supremacy.
and I agree. I think it's something that really, again, has to make sure that it's multiracial, that it's a representation throughout the region, that we look at, gender and youth, intergenerational. And I think one of the big things we need to be looking at is climate justice. Because that's something that we can't escape with the fires, the flooding, the pandemics. This is not the last, we all know it. And we know already who were the most impacted by this latest pandemic or the pandemics before that. It's always been people of color, low income, those without access to health care. We continue. So I think that the climate justice has to be one of the forefront, because it is inclusive of all the elements. It's inclusive of the air, it's inclusive of the water. What's happened every time that there are flooding, then we're having to boil water, the water being contaminated with pollution. And so when we look at, the earth, what's ravaging with the fires, with the flood, what's happening to the soil, I think it's all inclusive in looking at the whole issue of climate justice and disasters. And then, of course, I agree with the systemic racism. We definitely have to continue on that path. There's been a lot of accomplishments, a lot of groups that are undoing racism. And for a first time, I can say for the first time in the history of Austin, this is the first time that our local climate plan included equity and the development of equity tools, but not just equity, but is land acknowledgement, is whose land are we on, is acknowledging that indigenous people were here and have been here and are still here. We might not have our headdress on it, we're still here. And that land acknowledgement, that was the first time ever in this new City of Austin climate plan that was included. And so I think that issue needs to be looked at, and the whole issue of capitalism. And how do we deal with capitalism? And capitalism in the electoral process, because we've seen that the electoral process has gone just completely crazy. How crazy and madness it has become from, barriers that have become all over the United States. The war between people who are very racist and those who want to change society and be more of a multicultural racial society. It's at its peak now, this division. And so I think that we really need to be looking at those processes, like I said, but I think that people are going to find that climate justice, and again, here's the mainstream again looking at climate plans without trying to make sure that people of color are included in climate plans, that we have an equitable and just climate plan. And that's worldwide, because we know who is going to be impacted. And if they're making like the thing they did before, that Bernice, the swap for land, and stuff still going on, a lot of those changes, we have to be there at the forefront. We have to continue to speak for ourselves. We have to continue to make those policies. We need to continue to be in that process, and we need to continue to educate and inform the next generation, and continue to be in a generation, because just looking at our economists, people don't know, and what Mildred said, the struggle, the people who have put their lives out there, the people who have given their lives in this struggle, that we can't forget that either. That there has been people who in the modern days, in these centuries, who have died in this struggle to make sure that we have a better world. And so I'll leave it at that.
We have a question from Carolina Martinez. In the EJ movement in California, we refer to our communities as EJ communities. As agencies recognize our communities via tools like Cal EnviroScreen, they refer to us as disadvantaged communities. We think that this is deficit mentality. How should agencies name our communities, EJ communities? How do we feel about them using that term to refer to our communities? I have concerns that they then get to define us. Thoughts?
It's a wonderful question, Carolina. Thank you for it. We need to shift that narrative, right? And we need to do away with the disadvantaged communities, the disproportionately impacted. And though I use it myself, so let me take responsibility. I use it myself, but I think we need to spend some time coming up with a new narrative about how we want to talk about the work, how we want to talk about people who are affected by the work. And of course, that needs to be done with those people themselves about how they want to see the conversation go out into the universe. But you are so right. The deficit framing continues to disempower, I think, and take away the power of the voice of people who have changed the whole conversation, right? They are driving a national conversation about what this administration is going to do across the country and as it moves into international spaces. They're talking about climate justice. We gave them that language. They're talking about environmental justice. We gave them that language. Systemic racism and weeding it out across the whole of government. We gave them that language. So now it's time for us to take that language back and redefine. And, so all my brothers and sisters from EPA, if any of y'all are listening, we are going to have to do away with your definition of environmental justice once and for all, because it is just so harmful. It is so harmful. And it was, coming out the gate in 1990, not knowing what y'all were going to do. Okay, but it's 2021 now, and we need to let that go. So I'm still working with Bunyan Bryant's definition of environmental justice, and that's always going to be the definition that I use. It's affirming. It talks about biological diversity. It talks about justice, right? People who respect biological diversity also respect justice, right? It talks about fighting the isms. It talks about centering people, affirmation, right? I mean, we all know that in every faith tradition. Speak it into the universe so that it can become manifest. And that's what we did with the principles of environmental justice. And it's time for us to do some work again. And I send out a request to the young folks to do all those platform things that y'all do and help that conversation go virtual, because y'all got that, right? But we need to reclaim our language and tell people how we want this conversation to go forward. And it's got to be centered in the communities that are living and breathing that experience.
Yeah, I think Susanna put it earlier, that words have power. And I'm a believer in Jesus Christ, just so people know. And so I am a firm believer that we speak those things that be not as though they are. We so it can be manifested into what is truth. It may be a fact. There may be a set of facts that define our existence. That ain't the truth, though. The truth of the matter that we are a great people. And the deal is that we have to speak that. We have to manifest that and get in front of it. Like Bernice, I'm done with all of the deficits that define who we are and, always being at the bottom. We got to start seeing ourselves and speaking that thing that is real truth. So I don't have anything different from Bernice. We have to get in the in this framework of redefining and imagining what we really are. We're not just in this deficit. We have much power. We have much talent, much skill, much creativity. If it weren't for this young Black woman, we wouldn't even have a vaccine for the COVID. So I'm going to tell you, it's time to start speaking truth about who we truly are as a collective of people. That's all I got to say. I don't know what it's going to say, what actually will manifest, but it will be, it's time for it.
Question from Nancy Wright. Let's see. What are the most progressive, revolutionary international organizations that are working on these issues?
What are the most progressive international organizations that are working on this issue? Wow.
Well, we may not know them
That's
because they're working on the ground. There's a group in the Gambia that's working with Connie Tucker's daughter, Oli Tau. Connie Tucker is one of our soldiers who have gone home and is now an ancestor. They're doing great work in the Gambia. There are groups in Senegal that's doing some work around environmental justice. The Harambe House back in the 90s was able to introduce environmental justice to the Senegalese civil society as well as the government. And so those are some of the principles that they're working into their laws and regulations as they develop their environmental programs. In South Africa, one of the most strongest groups was the Environmental Justice Networking Forum. But of course, because of resources over the years, it has decreased in size and nature, but they were doing a lot of good work across South Africa. I surmise that there are probably many international groups that are doing work, particularly on the ground, but they don't get the airplay so that we know them as we should. And that's something that we have to look at, is how do we continue to build our relationships and our international relations, because it is a global struggle. It's a global fight. And when we strengthen that, we're going to see much more progress. Because a lot of times, and I'm going to give this example and shut up, when we get rid of a policy here in the US, just take leaded gas, the company will just simply go overseas, go to Africa, and they be selling leaded gas there. And so we have to be very, very cognizant of how we build those relationships so that the violations that we have identified in the US doesn't get transported to other places.
And I just want to add that the other group is Grassroots for Global Justice.
Yeah.
So that's a group that works internationally with a lot of other groups, but that's one way to connect with. Grassroots for Global Justice has a lot of relationships with different groups throughout the world, and specifically a lot within Central America. And I agree with Mildred. There's a lot of groups that we don't know. There's groups that we've encountered in short stage as we've gone, to South Africa or China or Brazil. There are a lot of different groups that are working on different issues.
I just want to lift up some of the groups. Jackie Patterson is dropping some gems into the chat.
Mm-hmm.
She mentioned Grassroots Global Justice, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, Grassroots International, and the beloved Third World Network, who we first connected with at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. I'm still on their mailing list, and I still get their publication from 1992 until today. They have followed me every place that I've lived, and I still get their magazine. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Third World Network.
Mm-hmm.
I want to put one last question, and then we'll follow up with any questions we don't get to and email to our panelists. So this is from Kwaku Aurelien. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. So this is for Dr. McLean. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the modern interconnections between the environmental evils that we as Africans in America face and those faced by Africans on the mother continent. I know you mentioned the townships in apartheid South Africa as a prominent example.
They got everything we got. I can put it just like that. Anything we got, they got it. Particularly in terms of waste, lot of that plastic. When you go to Africa, I don't care where you go, the little black bags and blue bags and green bags of nothing but plastic, plastic, plastic. So when you go into the rural area, you see it all along the countryside. You see it on the ocean. You see them burying household waste, waste from small businesses. Definitely landfills is, oh my gosh, darn, you could be riding in a beautiful subdivision in Senegal and all of a sudden you like feel like you're in just a big dump. Miles and miles of waste. So they look like mountains, like in Alabama and Mississippi. Certainly in places like South Africa, you have the whole piece around nuclear power plants, where electricity is being generated for the rich, and they are situated and sited in the poor townships, but they don't get no electricity and nothing like that. They have, like I would just say in general, because I'm cognizant of the time, is many of the issues that we face here as African Americans or New Africans or Blacks, Negroes, Coloreds, whichever one y'all want to do today, are the same ones that are faced right in Africa, not only in Africa, but often when we think of Central, South, and Latin America, we think of just brown people, but there are many, 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 many Black people there as well. And those countries, those continents are facing the same fate. And I would say it's all summed up in that old word that we hate to use. There's two of them. It's called colonialism and imperialism. And the one that Susanna raised earlier, capitalism. Wherever they go, they leave that footprint. But they start here, and then they export, and then they make better, and then they bring back here. So it's a very vicious cycle that they put us in. But that's a short answer to your question.
Okay, I hate we have to pause, but I want to thank the panel, first of all. Thank you so much for sharing your time, your expertise, the histories that you brought to this space today. I was very excited coming in. I interviewed Bernice, so I knew some of the the background experiences in terms of the summit. I really wanted to give you all and have our attendees have a chance to kind of reconnect with this history. I think we had a conversation earlier this week how many of those who are just entering these spaces are just not aware because they don't have access to the history. The work's been done before. So I just really want to have you speaking your own voice, your own words, what your experiences were those couple of days, but also your experiences leading up to that point and since then. And to our attendees, thank you very much for spending the time with us and sticking in an extra half an hour or so. We will follow up with you with a survey, with resources, all sent to you in one document. And also any questions we didn't get to, we will forward to the panelists and have them have any responses and send them out to you all. I hope you will join us throughout the rest of the month for our conversations. Next Saturday, which is the 13th, we will be hosting our second forum, environmental advocacy amid dual pandemics. So this idea, so COVID-19, the dual pandemics everyone was writing about this past year and a half. So you have COVID-19, but also the discovery on the part of many of systemic racism. So how do we put those two in a environmental lens? How do you look at those through the lens of environmental racism and activism? And we'll be led in conversation by Dr. Marva King, our moderator. Our panelists will be Nikisa Glover, founder and executive director of Soul Nation, Rita Harris from the Sierra Club National Board of Directors, Jackie Patterson, who joined us today. Nice to see you here, Jackie. Senior Director of Environmental and Climate Justice Program at NAACP, Diana Waddington, Principal of Joyful Works and Consulting. So that's next weekend. The following weekend, the 20th, we're looking at climate justice, who's on with us today. Hi, Cynthia, good to see you. Adrienne Hollis of the Union of Concerned Scientists, Caroline Lewis, founder of Clio Institute in Florida, and Nettie Estudillo, Saturday of the month. We're looking, the future is here. We led in conversation by Tamara Toles O'Loughlin, who's online with us today, Erica Dickerson Dispenza, cultural worker and playwright in residence at Public Theater, Sakita Grant with the Solutions Project, and Karina Newsom with Georgia Audubon. We'll send out more information about this, but please join us for more conversation discussion over the course of this month. Really, these spaces are meant to be open to you for free dialogue, honest dialogue, respectful dialogue, but it's this idea of making the work of the women today and also in our upcoming forums accessible. Right, so we want to respect you for your expertise, your knowledge, your history, but also to know, understand that the work you've done, the spaces that you've entered in, the spaces that you've helped to create, they're accessible to those who are watching. So if you want to join into this work, these various movements, there's a pathway for you, there's a space for you. And these are women, human beings who come from communities, who've entered these spaces, and this idea of what are the next steps to generations that will take. And so there's the space for you at these various tables. And if you want to get there, how do you get there? And we made in conversation for our panelists today and those that will come over the course of this month, examples, models, best practices of how to enter these spaces. And it's all within your reach. And it's your right to be asking these questions, to be sitting in the rooms, having these conversations, think about the history, think about not only the history, but the present, but also the future of our communities writ large, inclusive of green and blue spaces. So once again, thank you so much for spending your Saturday with us. We'll send out more information. Thank you to our panel. Very happy to see your faces. And we hope we'll see you all next week at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Take care, everyone. Be happy, be healthy. We'll be in touch soon. Bye-bye.